of all, I'd like to congratulate the undertaking. I'd like to congratulate the whole team for very insightful, timely, and brave, I think, audacious publication. And it's one that should be read. If possible, it should be translated into your local languages. If possible, be really good. Secondly, in reading the book, I became a regionalist for this reason. I welcome the fact that we have academics and friends, NGOs from the region writing about the region, because a lot of the information about the region has been written from outside. And I'm not nationalistic or regionalistic in that sense, in terms of rejecting comments from outside, but I am regionalistic in terms of welcoming inputs from this region. And that's what the book does in terms of providing space for academics and friends, the media, etc., from this region to analyze, self-analyze a little bit, and that's good. And then, as has been said, today, of course, we have to reappraise everything from the COVID perspective. And I will go into this in my next 15 points very quickly. Number one, spectra has been explained already in terms of the different shades of the dimensions of authoritarianism. I'm equally concerned about the spectacle of authoritarianism, the fact that it appears and still appears, and the fact that it is re-authoritarianism, the fact that it's reappearing in certain countries. And from that perspective, what we're concerned with is what I would call political recidivism. The fact that we swing one way and the other in terms of backwards and forwards in terms of authoritarianism, which is pretty well illegal according to many constitutions of these countries, which are sadly sometimes overturned by coup d'etat. So that's one major concern, the political recidivism and the spectacle of authoritarianism that reappears as re-authoritarianism. Secondly, Southeast Asia here, I welcome the fact that you have covered not only ASEAN, but also Timor-Leste. And I would just note that, of course, if we look at ASEAN as an organization, which the book deals with a little bit, but not very much, the mindset of ASEAN is not necessarily democratic at all. I mean, it didn't begin like that. The premise was not authoritarianism versus democracy from the very start in 1967. The premise of ASEAN as a whole was actually sort of making peace and stability at that point in time. But today, of course, we welcome the fact that we can raise issues concerning democracy and human rights much more, even though the space is still very constrained. Thirdly, the different shades of authoritarianism are well documented in the papers. Some very individualistic type of authoritarianism attached to a certain figure. Other types which are more sort of group-based, linked with a military group, or systemic or mixed. And all that, I think, thirdly, has to be seen from a historical perspective of how the history of authoritarianism has not been well written in many of these countries, precisely because the history has been co-opted. It's been written according to a certain authoritarian narrative, and we must change that by pluralizing the history concerned about our political cultures. Fourthly, we look to authoritarianism in ASEAN, and it's true, it's not homogeneous. I mean, you have monarchical, you have presidential, you have prime ministerial. But what is true is that the executive gains a lot of power, is gaining a lot more power because of COVID. And that we have to be very careful about. And we have to ask ourselves, what about the checks and balances, which still need to be nurtured? Fifth, as the book has explained, authoritarianism is different from totalitarianism. The latter is much more controlled, much more surveyed. But if you look at aspects of this region, some of the countries are really moving towards totalitarianism. I mean, the classic case I've dealt with for the United Nations is North Korea. But there are certain aspects in our region which are creeping along that line in terms of total control and total surveillance, which we classify as totalitarianism. Of course, in this perspective, we would like to broaden the space and to have those counterbalances. Sixth, features elements of authoritarianism that you can see in this region and beyond. Not again homogeneous, but they appear, they pop up here and there in their different ways. Unelected government, unelected executive, coup d'etat, no multi. When there's an election, so-called, it's not a free and fair election, and or elimination of opposition and or civil space. And if you look through these different indicators, we'll find plenty of evidence from our region in terms of authoritarianism. 7, there are Southeast Asian countries which are formally democracies, happily, in a good sense, in terms of elected and pretty well fair, free elected. I mean, Indonesia is one. Philippines at a certain level is also elected by a certain majority. But the proof of the pudding is not just that. We have other indicators that I just listed, which have to test the workings of the elected government. And very sadly, even in these 1 or 2 or 3 so-called democratic countries in ASEAN, you will have manifestations of undemocratic practices which are authoritarian, and which I will look at in a moment in terms of not so good practices. That was number 7, I think. And number 8 is the fact that in these undemocratic authoritarian settings, of course, it is the civil and political rights which suffer first, I think, as identified. Clampdown on free expression, peaceful assembly, greater securitization, advocacy, which I disagree with, of national security, disproportionate limitations on rights. And what one of the chapters uses as a term, which is very interesting, pragmatic practices, pragmatism, which are not compliant with human rights. So even if you have democratic government, which uses pragmatic practices, you still have to test those practices, pragmatism, through the eyes of international standards to offset against the subjectivity at the local level. We need objectivization of those practices. 9, the tools of authoritarianism can be found very much in the various papers, the 9 different papers, different tools, Sedition Act, security related legislation, Public Order Act, Peaceful Assembly Act, which is actually a clampdown on peaceful assembly. But I think what's very important is that a lot of the laws are also geared against people who are in a minority situation. And I would cite one that's popping up at the moment, which does not appear in the book, which I'm not agreeable to. In one country, which is democratic, you have the emerging family resilience bill, which is targeted against sexual orientation and gender identity. And it's going to compel people who are LGBTI to undergo a conversion therapy, forced conversion therapy, if this law passes in this democratically elected government, so to speak, of that country. So beware of all these countries, especially in terms of laws and policies directed against different types of minorities, including the opposition, but also sexual minorities and beyond. Number 10, I would just note that one of the papers, which I welcome, is on membership of human rights treaties or lack of membership. And it is evident that from our region, the fact that you sign up to something is not necessarily a real commitment at all, but it's a facade. It's facadism in a certain way. However, human rights treaties and the whole UN human rights system can be used to some extent as a check and balance. So let's not forget that. I mean, you have special procedures, you have rapporteurs and so on, who are independent of those treaties and who can help all the same. So let's make use of all the tools we have internationally and elsewhere to check and balance against this creeping pathway of authoritarianism, not forgetting all the human rights treaties and the monitoring and pressures, the special procedures, complaints mechanisms, and the international criminal accountability, including use of the International Criminal Court, together with the total UN system. At times, the Security Council works, at times it doesn't, but you have to press leverage with all of them to make good use of the leveraging. 11, weakening of checks and balances comes through some of the papers, such as an anti-corruption commission in one country being watered down. National human rights institutions, commissions also watered down on some fronts in terms of cooptation. But again, I mean, don't give up. You still have to build those checks and balances. And if not at the national level, at the regional level and or at international level. 12th, the role of the military and civilian rule. What's the space for the military that we have to try to accommodate somehow? And in one of the papers, it's very interesting, you send them out to do peacekeeping. But again, even if they do the peacekeeping, it's not very easy to reform at the local level. But I think we still have to be creative in terms of finding a role for the military so that they will have to accept civilian rule. And civilian rule is not just going to be civilian rule, it has to be civilian rule that at least tries to deliver in terms of the totality of rights, civil, political, economic, social, cultural, as well as all the other aspects of human well-being. So judicious civilian rule, wise civilian rule is very important. 13, I would just note that the papers don't deal too much about how authoritarian governments deliver in terms of economic, social, cultural rights. I mean, some of them might do quite well on food or on healthcare. So let's be transparent about that while being critical where we need to be. And some of them claim to be quite clean. And one of them is quite clean, but not very democratic. So let's balance a little bit. But again, there's no justification for authoritarianism in the final analysis. 14, the issue of not just human rights and democracy, test the whole authoritarian spectrum from the angle of peace. I mean, how do they perform in terms of peace? And also good governance, cleanliness, transparency, and also sustainable development. And you might have shades of different analyses there in terms of how they perform or not perform. And today, the metaphor that they all use is there's a war against COVID. So that is the metaphor they're all using now. So you have to test them a little bit in terms of, number one, is it justifiable to use that metaphor? Number two, is that really necessarily, and does it lead to worse limitations on rights and responsibilities? And finally, 15, I wish you talked about gender and particularly the role of women a bit more. Women don't stage coup d'etats generally, from what I've seen. Why? So what is the genderized perspective of authoritarianism, even though, of course, we'd like to be open to all in terms of participation. Finally, 5 very quick suggestions for the future. Number 1, we need to build checks and balances. There is creeping ascendancy of the executive branch at the moment, particularly with COVID. The tools they use indicate this. So be very careful of an even stronger executive today because of COVID. And yet we have to build checks and balances like parliament, judiciary, civil society, social media, and linkage with the international community, human rights institutions and beyond. We can't give up, and we don't. Number 2, let's balance also in terms of links with the regional perspective and the multilateral perspective. Let's not forget the tools we have internationally. Treaty bodies, special procedures, the total UN system, the international public opinion and beyond. Against monopoly of power, we are fighting, so to speak, if we say fight, we are working against monopoly of power, which is ensconced, entrenched, sadly, in authoritarianism in our region. Number 3, post-COVID and COVID. We need a counter push to make the situation more transparent, to analyze about the tools being used today, which may constrain our rights and responsibilities, rights and duties, rights and limitations even more in future. We need to make the situation more transparent and dismantle those tools which are not internationally acceptable, particularly certain security laws which are used to trample on people's rights. Number 4, the digital age. Digital tools are being used today to clamp down on people. And even, you know, the application to enter a shopping mall today is going to invade your privacy, so to speak. So beware of digital tools, which will be used, sadly, by authoritarian regimes. However, why not think of it conversely, in terms of also how do we use digital tools, digitalization against authoritarianism? And we've seen some examples of this. For example, on Myanmar, you know, Facebook has been taking down some of the hate speech and working a little bit more effectively at times than the UN Security Council on this front. And finally, last but not least, don't give up, because democracy starts at home, and sadly, authoritarianism often starts at home and the community and the schools, education. So even if we can't reach that high to changing the state 100%, we can change ourselves a little bit in terms of starting with ourselves at home, in the school, and in the community. Pluralize, democratize the home and the classroom. Don't beat children, please. No corporal punishment. Enable people to speak, appreciate differences of opinion and diversity. Respect. And last but not least, if the book is about the sins of the state, where is there room for redemption? My answer is this: don't wait for the state to redeem. Redemption starts with ourselves through good practices. It is good deeds, good people who will win. Thank you.